What you're about to see is the level of discipline that most people call extreme, obsessive, or even frightening, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why it works and why the version of discipline you've been practicing has a ceiling that this one doesn't. Picture someone you know who seems to operate differently from everyone else. Not louder, not more motivated, just somehow more consistent, more deliberate, more immune to the things that derail everyone around them. You probably describe them as disciplined. But what they actually have is something different from what most people call discipline. And the distinction is the whole point of this video. Here's the counterintuitive part I'll come back to later. The scariest level of discipline is actually the one that requires the least willpower. Type the word iron in the comments right now if you want to see how that works. Let's start with where you actually are. Not where you think you are, where you actually are. You set the alarm for 5:30, you hit snooze at 5:30, at 5:40, at 5:50. By the time you're actually moving, it's 6:15 and you're already behind the day's rhythm, already reactive, already compensating. You grab your phone because there's a pull there that predates conscious thought, a habit so deep it's practically reflexive. And before you've had a single intentional thought of your own, you're inside other people's content, other people's opinions, other people's curated version of what the world looks like this morning. Then work. Then the coworker who pulls you into a conversation you didn't want to be in. Then the evening that evaporates somewhere between the sofa and the third video you didn't plan to watch. Then bed. Then 5:30 again. The alarm you set again with full intention because tonight feels different. The cost of this isn't productivity. That's the surface level explanation people use because it's easier to measure. The real cost is something more fundamental. The steady erosion of your belief that you are actually in charge of your own life. Every time the alarm goes off and you choose to snooze, a small but real message gets locked internally that you are someone who says one thing and does another. Every time you pick up the phone on autopilot, you confirm to yourself that your attention is available to whoever wants it. These aren't dramatic failures, they're quiet ones. And quiet failures accumulate in ways that loud ones don't, because you never get a clear moment of reckoning. You just wake up one day and the person in the mirror has been shaped by 10,000 small surrenders you barely remember making. Epictetus, who had no freedom in the external sense, who was born a slave and spent years with almost no control over the circumstances of his physical life, wrote something that reorients this entire conversation. He said that most people make the mistake of trying to control everything around them while neglecting the one thing they actually can control, their own response. He wasn't being passive, he was being precise. He understood that a person who cannot govern the gap between impulse and action is at the mercy of whoever or whatever knows how to trigger those impulses. And in the modern world, there are entire industries whose sole purpose is to trigger yours at scale all day for profit. The battlefield is your attention. The question is whether you've trained to hold it. So here is the central truth this video is built on, stated plainly. Real discipline is not about motivation. It is about structure. It is the construction of conditions so deliberate and so consistent that the right behavior becomes what happens by default, and the wrong behavior becomes the one that requires effort. That reframe changes everything, because motivation is whether it comes and goes, and you cannot command it. Structure is architecture. You build it once, it does the work regardless of how you feel. This is not asceticism. It's not about suffering or deprivation or becoming some kind of emotional robot who doesn't enjoy anything. That's the caricature. The reality is the opposite. People with this level of structural discipline enjoy their lives with more clarity and more genuine pleasure than people who are constantly negotiating with themselves about what they should be doing. There's no negotiation inside a well-built structure. The decision was made in advance. That's the whole point. The modern version of discipline, the version social media rewards and celebrates, is dramatic. It's the cold plunge at 5 a.m., the dramatic announcement of the new routine, the progress photo and the motivational caption. That version sells well because it's visible. It's also fragile because it's built on a feeling, and feelings change. What we're building here is invisible and indestructible. Let's get into it. The first level is the discipline of your environment. And if this one sounds obvious, it's because most people know it and still don't do it. You are trying to read. You have the book in front of you, good intentions, a quiet 15 minutes, but the phone is on the table, face up, within arm's reach, you haven't touched it. But some part of your cognitive bandwidth is allocated to the possibility that it might buzz, that something might be happening, that you might be missing something. And that small allocation, that background hum of potential distraction is measurably degrading the quality of your reading, even though you haven't looked at the phone once. The distraction doesn't have to activate to do its damage. Its presence is enough. Epictetus wrote that you should examine what you have in your power and what you don't, and then arrange your life accordingly. The phone within reach is an environment you have power over. The impulse it creates, once it's there, is significantly harder to manage. The structural discipline move is to remove it from the room before the session begins, not to resist looking at it, but to make looking at it require deliberate effort. When the bad option requires effort and the good option requires none, you've built an environment that works for you instead of against you. This connects to what behavioral scientists and psychologists describe as decision fatigue, the well-established pattern where the quality of human decision-making deteriorates as a function of the number of decisions made, regardless of the complexity of those decisions. Every time you resist the phone, you spend cognitive resources. Every time you've arranged your environment so that resistance isn't required, you preserve those resources for decisions that actually matter. This is not laziness, it is resource management. The person who leaves the phone in another room isn't weak, they're applying leverage. The reframe is this: environmental design is not a shortcut around discipline. It is discipline at its highest efficiency. Instead of fighting your environment every day, you redesign it once and then the environment fights your impulses on your behalf. Start today. Identify the 3 objects in your physical space that most reliably pull you toward behaviors you don't want. Move them, not permanently, not dramatically, just far enough that accessing them requires a deliberate decision rather than a reflex. Do it before tomorrow morning and notice what the morning feels like differently. The second level is the discipline of your time. And this is where the majority of people who have good intentions still fail completely. It's Tuesday evening, you have an hour before bed and you intend to spend it on something meaningful, writing, reading, a skill you're developing, anything that moves you forward. But the hour has no container. There's nothing defining when it starts, nothing defining when it ends, and nothing protecting it from the softer option of doing whatever requires the least initiation energy. By the time you're halfway through the hour, you've spent 40 minutes in a choice paralysis between options, and the remaining 20 aren't long enough to do anything substantial. The hour evaporated. It wasn't stolen, it dissolved. Seneca wrote something that should feel like a slap to anyone living in the modern attention economy. He said that we act as if we have unlimited time, that we postpone everything, and that life races past while we're busy arranging it. He wrote this in a letter roughly 2000 years ago, and he was describing you and me with uncomfortable accuracy. The specific waste he was diagnosing wasn't busyness, it was the failure to treat time as what it actually is, which is the one resource that is genuinely non-renewable and completely finite. The psychological concept of temporal discounting is relevant here. This is the well-documented tendency to value immediate rewards more heavily than future ones, in a way that isn't rational but is deeply human. When you're choosing between the meaningless comfortable option and the meaningful uncomfortable one, your brain is not running an objective cost-benefit analysis. It's applying a discount rate to the future benefit that makes it feel smaller than the immediate relief, even when the math clearly favors the future. Knowing this doesn't eliminate the pattern, but understanding it lets you build structures that counteract it before the choice moment arrives. The reframe. An unscheduled hour is not free time, it is undefended time. And undefended time will be captured by whatever is most immediately rewarding. The discipline of time is not about working more, it is about deciding in advance what each hour is for, and then protecting that decision with enough environmental support that the decision holds under the natural pressure of the moment. The practice is time blocking with specificity. Not, I'll work on the project tonight, but from 8 to 9, I will be at the desk, phone in the other room, working specifically on the opening section. The more specific the container, the easier it is to begin, because beginning is the hardest part. and specificity removes the activation energy required to decide what to do next. Block 3 hours this week with that level of specificity and notice how different it feels to start. Here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. How many of the things you say are your priorities are actually protected by your schedule? Because your priorities are not what you say, they are what you protect. The third level is the discipline of your mind. And this is where it starts to get genuinely difficult, because the environment you can physically rearrange, the time you can block on a calendar, but the mind is running on a substrate that doesn't respond to the same interventions, and the discipline required to work with it is a different category entirely. You're in a conversation and someone says something that triggers a reaction, not an extreme reaction, just the familiar, low-level irritation of being misunderstood or disagreed with or dismissed. And before you've processed what you actually want to say, the reaction is already forming the tone shift, the edge in the voice, the defensiveness, the version of events that positions you correctly and them incorrectly. This isn't a character flaw, it's a wiring tendency. The brain moves faster toward emotional conclusions than toward rational ones, especially under social pressure, because that wiring predates social sophistication by a considerable distance on an evolutionary timeline. Marcus Aurelius returned to a specific idea again and again in his private journals, written for no audience, with no performance in them. He kept reminding himself that between stimulus and response there is a gap, and that the ability to inhabit that gap, to not rush through it, was the single most important discipline available to a human being. Not because it made you passive, but because it made you precise. He called this the inner citadel, the interior fortress, that cannot be taken by external events unless you open the gate yourself. This connects to what's sometimes described as the neurological phenomenon of the amygdala hijack, a term from Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, where the brain's threat detection system activates faster than the prefrontal cortex can engage, producing emotional reactions that override rational processing. The gap Marcus Aurelius wrote about is essentially the discipline of buying time for the prefrontal cortex to come online before you speak or act. This is not suppression, it's sequencing. You're not trying to eliminate the reaction. You're trying to delay its expression long enough that reason can influence the response. The reframe. Emotional reactivity isn't weakness, it's an untrained strength. The impulse to respond, to defend, to correct is energy. Discipline of the mind doesn't kill that energy. It redirects it into responses that are more precise, more effective, and more aligned with your actual values, rather than responses that primarily serve to relieve the immediate pressure of the feeling. The practice is simple and almost infuriatingly difficult. The 2-breath rule. Before responding to anything that provokes you in person, in text, in the space between someone finishing their sentence and you beginning yours, take 2 full deliberate breaths. Not as a performance, as a genuine physiological intervention. The breath activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the body's rest and digest system that functions as a counterweight to the stress response. 2 breaths will not eliminate the reaction. They will create enough of a gap that the reaction no longer has to be your response. The 4th level is the discipline of consistency over intensity. And this is the one that separates people who make occasional impressive efforts from people who build extraordinary lives. Picture 2 people beginning a new practice, writing, training, a creative skill, anything that compounds over time. The first person attacks it with intensity, they dedicate entire weekends to it, go deep for long sessions, make dramatic progress in short bursts, they post about it, they feel the momentum. The second person does 30 minutes per day, every day, without exception, without drama, no posts, no announcements, no intensity, just continuity. After 1 week, the first person looks more disciplined. After 3 months, the second person has done more work, retained more, and built a structural habit that runs almost automatically. After a year, the gap is staggering. Seneca observed that the person who makes a little progress each day will eventually outrun the person who moves in impressive leaps followed by long rests. He framed it as a question of reliability, not how much you can do when conditions are favorable, but what you reliably do when they aren't. The test of discipline is not your best day, it is your worst day. It is the day when motivation is entirely absent and the conditions are wrong and you still show up and do the thing, even a diminished version of the thing, because showing up is not about quality, it's about maintaining the identity of someone who doesn't break the chain. The psychological concept of habit formation, as described by researchers including Philippa Lally at University College London, points to something important here. Repetition builds automaticity more than intensity does. When a behavior is repeated consistently in the same context, same time, same cue, same environment, it gradually requires less conscious decision-making to execute. Eventually, it becomes what you might call identity-level behavior, not something you decide to do, but something you simply are. The person who writes every morning isn't motivated every morning. They just write the same way you brush your teeth without deciding whether to. The behavior has been automated by repetition. Intensity can produce results. Only consistency produces the automation that makes results sustainable. The reframe: intensity is a feeling, consistency is a decision. The scary version of discipline is not the person having the intense moment, it is the person who is still showing up 6 months later with no intensity at all, just structure, just repetition, just the quiet accumulation of days. Start by identifying the one practice you want to build that has the highest long-term return for you. Not the most dramatic one, not the one that would impress people, the one that actually matters most. Then design the minimum viable version, the smallest possible execution of that practice that still counts. 5 minutes counts, 1 page counts, 10 push-ups count. Whatever the minimum is, commit to it for 30 days without missing before you touch the ceiling. The minimum builds the identity. The identity carries the expanded practice. Start with the minimum. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching a video. You're auditing your own patterns, which is already something most people avoid. That takes a specific kind of honesty. If this is resonating, hit the like button right now, not for me, but as a concrete signal to yourself that you're taking this seriously. And here's what's coming in the second half. I said at the beginning that the scariest level of discipline requires the least willpower. That sounds wrong. It sounds like a contradiction. The resolution to that contradiction is what we are building toward. And it's the one idea in this video that, once you understand it, changes everything else. Stay with me. The fifth level is the discipline of your identity, and this is where the shift from behavior management to something much deeper actually begins. You're at a social event and the food is exactly the kind of food you've been trying to avoid. Everyone around you is eating it. The social pressure is low grade but real. Someone offers it to you. There's a moment where declining feels like a statement, like you're being difficult or self-righteous. And so you eat it. Not because you were hungry, not because you wanted it, because declining required an identity declaration you weren't prepared to make publicly, because the person you want to be and the person you perform in social situations are still two different people. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person's character is built by what they do, not by what they intend, not what they plan to do next Monday, not the version of themselves they are working toward, the actual repeated behaviors. Character is not aspiration, it is pattern. And the most powerful form of discipline is not the willpower to do the right thing when it's hard. It is having built an identity so clearly defined that the right thing is simply what you do, in the same way that a fish doesn't decide to swim. James Clear, in his book Atomic Habits, articulates a concept that maps directly onto this. The idea that the most effective behavior change is identity-based rather than outcome-based. The person who says, I'm trying to quit smoking, is still negotiating their identity. The person who says, I'm not a smoker, has made a declaration that changes the architecture of the decision. One is fighting a craving, the other is simply being who they are. The discipline required to be consistent with your identity is significantly lighter than the discipline required to fight your impulses, because it operates at a different level of the system. The reframe. Discipline becomes easy when it becomes identity. The question to ask is not what do I need to do, but who do I need to become? Because the person you actually are at the identity level behaves consistently without willpower, without motivation, and without drama. The work is not in the daily doing. The work is in the construction of the self that does. The practice is a small daily act of identity reinforcement. Choose one behavior that you want to be true of the person you're becoming. Do it every day, and every time you do it, explicitly note it internally, not with pride necessarily, but with recognition. This is what I do. Over time, this creates what you might think of as an identity ledger, a growing record of evidence that you are the kind of person who does this thing. And as the evidence accumulates, the identity firms up, and the behavior becomes self-sustaining. You are not building a habit. You are building a self. The sixth level is the discipline of discomfort, and this is where it gets genuinely confronting because everything we've discussed so far can still be done in relative comfort with the right structure and the right framing. This level cannot. It's raining. The run was planned. The conditions are bad. The motivation is absent, and every reasonable part of you is generating reasonable arguments for why today is an exception. The exception would be rational. You could skip once without any real consequence. The problem is not the skipping. The problem is the conversation it initiates, the conversation where the mind learns that discomfort is a valid reason to stop, and that reasonable arguments will always be produced to justify stopping when stopping is what the body wants. That conversation once started expands. It spreads from the run to the work to the difficult conversation to the uncomfortable truth. The skill of overriding discomfort, or rather the skill of moving through it without treating it as a stop sign, is one of the most transferable skills a human being can build. Epictetus said that it is not the things that happen to us that disturb us, but our judgment about those things applied to discomfort, specifically the discomfort of the cold run, the hard session, the difficult conversation. None of it is objectively painful in a way that causes real harm. What makes it feel like a barrier is the judgment we layer on top of the sensation. The story that this particular discomfort is a sign to stop, a signal that something is wrong, a reason to wait for better conditions. The discipline of discomfort is the practice of detaching that judgment from the sensation of feeling the resistance fully and moving anyway. Not because you feel motivated, but because motion in the face of resistance is the thing you do. This connects to a concept in performance psychology sometimes called the mental toughness framework. The idea that high-performing individuals in demanding contexts are not people who feel less discomfort, but people who have developed a different relationship with discomfort. They don't experience it as less, they interpret it differently. The resistance is not a stop sign. It is confirmation that they are at the edge of their current capacity, which is exactly where growth happens. The discomfort is the signal, not the problem. The reframe. Discomfort is not evidence that something is wrong. It is evidence that something is working. The muscles don't grow without the tension. The mind doesn't expand without the challenge. Every significant capability you currently have was purchased by some earlier version of you enduring a discomfort they didn't fully want to endure. The discipline of discomfort is simply the willingness to keep paying that price on purpose. The practice is deliberate voluntary discomfort, one small, intentional exposure per day to something you'd rather avoid. This is not punishment, it is calibration. Cold shower, skip the comfortable snack you didn't need, have the conversation you've been postponing. Do the hard part of the project first, before anything else. The specific discomfort matters less than the pattern. It builds the identity of someone who does the hard thing without waiting to feel ready. Because ready is a feeling. The scariest discipline doesn't wait for feelings. And here's the counterintuitive turn I've been building toward this entire video. Most people think discipline is about doing more effort, more willpower, more resistance, more grinding through the things they don't want to do. That's the cultural narrative, the grind, the hustle, the graphic of someone running while everyone else sleeps. And that version of discipline works for a while, until it collapses under its own weight because it was always powered by a fuel source that depletes. Willpower is finite, motivation is weather, and a system built entirely on those resources is one injury, one difficult season, one prolonged hard period away from total breakdown. You've probably experienced this yourself, the ambitious start, the intense first weeks, the plateau, and then the crash, followed by guilt, followed by a new start, followed by the same arc. That's not failure. That's what happens when the architecture is built on will instead of structure. The scariest level of discipline is not the person who pushes hardest. It is the person who has built a system so well designed that the right behavior happens almost automatically, and who has simultaneously developed a relationship with discomfort so clear that when the system faces friction, as all systems eventually do, they move through it without drama. without the internal negotiation, without requiring a feeling of motivation to justify the action. That's why it requires less willpower, not more. Not because it's easier, it's harder to build. But once built, it runs on a different fuel entirely. The discipline of the person who has done this work doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like someone who simply does what they said they'd do every day, without announcement, without crisis, without the performance of effort that people who are struggling to maintain willpower inevitably produce. And that quiet, undramatic consistency is the scariest thing in the room because everyone can recognize it and almost no one can sustain it. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in those private journals that he should do his work and then move on, not seeking recognition for it, not cataloging it, not building an identity out of performing discipline publicly, just doing the work and then doing the next thing. He was describing a system in which the discipline was so internalized that it required no external reinforcement at all. It had become what he simply was. That's the level we're talking about. That's what the scariest version of this looks like. Now let me show you what your life actually looks like when you've built this. You wake up and there is no negotiation with the alarm goes off and you get up. Not because you're excited, not because you feel energized, because that is what you do and you are someone who does what they said they'd do, and the identity of that person is stronger than the feeling of the moment. You get up, your phone is not in your room, you don't reach for it because it isn't there to reach for. You move into the first hour of your day according to a structure you designed in advance in a moment of clarity before the pull of immediate comfort was in the room. The structure does the deciding, you do the doing. You sit down to the work. It's hard this morning. The ideas aren't flowing, the session isn't good, and some part of you is scanning for a reason to call this adequate and stop. You notice the scan. You don't follow it. You stay for the time you blocked, because the block is the commitment and the commitment is who you are, and who you are does not adjust based on how the session feels. Someone in your day says something that triggers you, you feel the reaction fully, clearly, without suppression. And then you breathe. Twice. And what comes out of your mouth is measured, deliberate, more effective than the reaction would have been, and completely aligned with the kind of person you're building. The reaction happened, it just didn't become your response. It rains, the run was planned, you put on the shoes and you run in the rain. Not because you're tough, not because you enjoy it, because you are someone who runs regardless of the conditions, and that identity is more stable than the weather. You come back wet and clear. The day has more in it because you kept the promise. At no point in this day do you feel like a machine. At no point do you feel deprived or constrained. You feel more than anything else like yourself, like a person who is operating from intention rather than reaction, from structure rather than mood, from identity rather than impulse. The chaos is still there, the noise is still present, the external world has not become cooperative, but your relationship to all of it has changed so fundamentally that it no longer has the same purchase on your behavior. You are not controlled by it, and that specific freedom, the freedom of a person who is not controlled by their environment or their impulses, is not something that can be taken from you because it lives in the architecture you've built, not in the circumstances around you. Here is your challenge for the next 7 days. Pick one of the 6 levels we covered: environment, time, mind, consistency, identity, or discomfort, and apply its core practice with no exceptions for the full week. Not all 6. 1. The one that you felt the most resistance toward while watching this, because that resistance is information. It's pointing at the ceiling you've already hit. Work at that specific ceiling for 7 days, without performance, without announcement, without measuring how it looks from the outside. Just the work. Because the scariest discipline isn't the one you display, it's the one that happens when no one's watching. Comment the word iron below, it's the signal that you're taking this seriously, and it helps this video reach the people who are ready for it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying all the way through. Stay iron.